Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second in our series of Westminster faith debates. The subject this evening is faith in schools. We had the first of our debates a couple of weeks ago. We felt it was generally very successful, and the research that's been done has had a fair degree of publicity and has been able to stimulate a wider debate. The subject is close to my own heart. I was Secretary of State for Education when we brought in a non-statutory religious education framework, and the issues of the place of the curriculum in general, of faith schools, of the place of religious worship in schools and so on, was a constant theme when I was Secretary of State. And I'm really delighted that the work that's been done in the research field is going to take this forward and take the discussion forward.
As you might have anticipated, probably the most controversial issue that we'll be talking about tonight is faith schools, which is fine, but it's not the only issue in town. And our aim in this whole series of debates is to paint a bigger picture of the place of faith in society, a picture which is informed by good research to move the debates on. And the big picture here is how we teach religion in schools, especially in state-funded schools, because that's where most of us were educated, leaving aside the odd Labour Party member. The kind of religious picture that we're looking at today and the whole school system that we're looking at still today really dates from 1944 and is part and parcel of the whole welfare state project. When it was brought into being by Rab Butler, around half of schools in England and Wales, if we exclude public schools, were church schools. Today, that's around a third, still around a third, so still quite a significant number of schools which have a religious character in the jargon. Most of these are so-called voluntary schools. That's a term that dates from their incorporation under Butler. Some voluntary aided, some voluntary controlled. And recently they've been joined by academies which have a religious character. Some of them are actually voluntary schools that have been taken into academy status, and some are new foundations like those Vardy schools I just mentioned. All state schools are required, it's statutory, to teach RE and have daily acts of collective worship. As I'm sure our collective experience in the room will know, how RE is taught has changed from religious instruction, much more Christian-based and confessional, to religious education. That change was recognised legally in the 1988 Education Reform Act and is reinforced in the non-statutory National Framework for RE 2004, which actually, Charles, I think you were responsible for introducing that non-statutory guidance. And there is, for RE, there is a legal opt-out clause for all parents. What kind of religions are represented in faith schools? Well, they're still predominantly Christian, around 68% Anglican, 30% Catholic. Of the remaining, there are just 38 Jewish schools, 11 Muslim, 3 Sikh, 1 Hindu, and some free church and ecumenical Christian. Final statistic, about 15 million people alive today went to a Church of England school. One reason why we're so pleased to have the Bishop of Oxford here with us.
We must not lose sight, in my view, of the importance of an education which covers all areas of human experience, including mathematical, scientific, aesthetic, philosophical, including the ethical, linguistic, historical, religious and spiritual, and so on. And I wish politicians would go back more to breadth in education related to the whole human person, and not just contemporary utility. I turn now to the issue of faith-based schools. Now, Linda has already explained that England has a long tradition of partially state-funded faith-based schools, and she's also explained that they are of different types. In our experience as researchers, and I should say we haven't done a project specifically on faith-based schools, but many faith-based schools have taken part in projects that we've done with schools in general. So first, in our experience, they are extremely diverse. We're not talking about one kind of thing. At one end of the spectrum, they're inclusive and they're outward looking. introducing young people to religious diversity in society. They do not use their status in order to proselytize, but as a basis for serving the community. At the other extreme, there are faith-based schools which maintain exclusivity. Their core activity is to transmit a particular faith tradition, and they avoid contact with other types of schools. They're two extremes. But non-faith-based schools also vary in the ways in which they relate to issues of religion. At one end of the spectrum, schools recognise and respect religious and ethnic difference in society. They create links with the community, including with different religious bodies, and are generally inclusive and outward-looking. At the other end are schools showing little or no interest in religious diversity and giving little support to religious education as a subject. Again, two extremes. As for justifying publicly funded faith-based schools in a democratic society, I return to my starting point. We need to refer to international law based on human rights principles concerning the rights of parents and the rights of children. In European law, parents have the right to bring up children in their own religious tradition. Whether the state is willing to fund such education is up to the state. Some do, some don't. Children, of course, also have rights, but their autonomy in law is governed by judgments about their maturity, and advice from legal specialists suggests that disputes between parents and children who claim maturity would need to be dealt with as individual cases. So, in conclusion, a European perspective reminds us that the right to hold a particular viewpoint within the law and parents' right to have their children educated in their religion are fundamental freedoms which we must respect within the context of our different national histories of education. And turning back to religious education in general, we need better provision. We need to strengthen its place in the curriculum. We need to strengthen teacher training, and we need to provide high-quality resources. Thank you.
We invited nearly 150 schools to join our project. We struggled to get 24. And when I asked many of the heads of religious education why they didn't want to partake in the project, they said they weren't sure that their religious education would stand up to the scrutiny. And that's a very serious issue. It's not that these were bad people doing a bad job. They were good people trying to do a very good job in very difficult circumstances. And what we found was that the circumstances were rather more difficult than even I had anticipated. But does it matter? If religious education is in the kind of state that I'm going to suggest, does it actually matter? Shouldn't we let religious education wither on the vine? My argument is absolutely not. Because where we saw religious education conducted effectively, it was brilliant. It was some of the best teaching that children got. What our study revealed was something absolutely fundamental to the education of young people. The creation of a space for serious, critical exploration of the meanings and values by which we live. To live good lives individually and collectively, we need to be able to make sense of the world and of ourselves. And religious education, still, for all its failings, is the only site that systemically and systematically tries to give a place in the curriculum for that. Our study found that in many state schools, £1 or less, in one instance 60 pence was spent per pupil per annum on all the resources for religious education. A young woman rang me up subsequently, or emailed me subsequently. She just started teaching in a high school in England, and she wanted my advice because her head teacher had decided to take religious education off timetable and give fourth year students 1 day a year and fifth year students 1 day a year. Don't bother. Whatever else it is not education. Religious education, I would argue, matters as never before. And one of the reasons that there's been a huge rise in the number of people submitting for religious education for GCSE and standard grade in Scotland is that RE teachers pressed want to give it substance. But what they find is that they have to give it substance in much less time than other humanities subjects. So how can they treat something with the seriousness it deserves without the resource to do so? Religious education matters as never before. We cannot understand our own culture without religious knowledge, let alone that of others. As religious and secular diversity increases, students need to be able to articulate their own beliefs and engage seriously with those of others. As respect and social harmony, I do believe, depend on this. What is happening to religious education in our schools is a scandal, for which I think we will pay a high price in years to come.
There's a running dichotomy that we've been hearing from both the speakers between learning about religion and learning religion in the sense of learning from religion, to use James Conroy's phrase. I would say learning about religion is something I'm thoroughly in favour of, and I would call it religious literacy. And a subset of that would be biblical literacy. Religious literacy seems to me extremely important because you need to understand religion in order to understand history and, regrettably, modern world affairs too. So whether you have a religious belief yourself or not, nobody could deny that there's an immensely important influence from religion on people's minds and hence on history and world affairs. If I were to speak of a socialist child or a conservative child or a Keynesian child or a Hayekian monetarist child or a postmodernist child, meaning a child whose parents subscribe to one of those views, you'd be shocked. How dare you label a child with the political and economic opinions of her parents? Shouldn't you ask the child her own opinion? Or if she's too young for that, wait until she's old enough. Robert Jackson told us that in European law, parents have the right to bring up children in their own religious tradition, which sounds like a good liberal freedom. But suppose it was suggested that parents have the right to bring up children in their own economic or political tradition. We'd all be hopping up and down with indignation. We're bringing Tommy up as a Hayekian monetarist. We're bringing Maisie up as a Levi-Straussian structuralist. We're bringing Katie up as a Jungian. That's preposterous. Yet our whole society swallows without a peep. We're bringing Sophie up Catholic.
Students themselves seem to recognise the importance of good RE. They relish it. Good RE, I'm talking about. The number of students taking RE, GCSE, long course or short course, rose from 113,000 to 460,000 in 15 years. Now, granted, the short course was a good way of meeting the requirements of compulsory RE, but the number of A-level students also tripled. Philosophy and ethics were especially popular because they scratch where young people itch. They're part of what John Milton called a complete and generous education. I like that phrase. We'd probably call it holistic, and it's what Robert Jackson was appealing for when he said, I wish politicians would go back more to breadth in education, related to the whole human person, and not just contemporary utility. And that's what RE helps. It helps that roundedness. So those are some of the reasons I believe in good RE. And remember, the British Humanist Association argues for good RE too. And as James Conroy pointed out, the picture is very mixed. And just now, the government is displaying what he calls a crippling ambivalence about RE. I just want to turn to that now. Just look at the facts. Fact 1. RE has been excluded from the EBAC with the result that there's been a 30% fall in the amount of time committed to RE teaching and learning, with a consequent loss of staff. The government says RE is safe because it's compulsory, but the danger is of a return to the PE teacher having to teach RE last lesson on a Tuesday afternoon because he had a spare. Do you remember? RE was the fastest growing exam subject in the country, but not now. Out of the EBAC, out of the gold standard. Fact 2, the government has excluded RE from the new round of curriculum development. I've regularly asked the government for an RE review parallel to the National Curriculum Review, But I think successive administrations have said, RE, there be dragons, we'll stay away. RE needs an upgrade. Fact 3, guidance and support for RE has been removed from the websites of the Qualifications and Curriculum Development Agency and the National Curriculum. What sort of a message is that? Take all the information away. Fact 4, the number of places for trainee RE teachers has been reduced over 2 years from 655 to 400. And the allocations this year are for 2/3 of the cohorts to be in single figures, which is said by the government to be non-viable. So the quality and the quantity of RE teaching is bound to fall.
Thank you for putting that question. Why do we not want to learn from religion as opposed to just about religion? I honestly don't think religion has anything useful to teach us. If you think about the possible candidates for what might be useful, in James Conroy's words, he said we need religion to make sense of our world and ourselves. Well, I think we need science for that.
Hi, my name's Charlotte Simpson. I'm a freelance radio producer. I'd like to address this largely to Professor Dawkins, and I would like to first of all say you do make debates so much more exciting. Your presence does make them stimulating, but I would like to disagree with you. You've said that 10% of parents in your people in your survey said they got their values from parents, and yet you've promoted...
10% got their values from religion.
Sorry, but you cited what percentage got their values from their parents.
25.
So a higher percentage. But you're promoting, I think, a rather totalitarian idea where parents can't teach their children to be Keynesian if they want to, can't teach their children to be socialist if they want to. I'm a parent. I will teach my child values. Where else is she to get my values? If I don't share them with her, surely it's my role as a parent to share what I believe. I teach her not to be homophobic. I teach her to be right on. I want her to read The Guardian and not the Mail, and that's just my right as a parent to share my views. And I want her to go out and, she doesn't have to follow what I say. She doesn't have to declare herself a Guardian reading 2-year-old, although she is very advanced. I'd be proud if she did.
Turning to the issue of identity and identification, it's a difficult one. When I read Richard's work, which I find, extremely interesting, what I read is a kind of an understanding of religion as a set of propositions which are either true or false. What I don't read is what I would call religion as a way of life. And I think I started to begin to understand something about religious diversity when I first came to Coventry in 1972 and met refugees from Uganda, South Asians who'd been given 90 days to get out of the country by General Amin. Now, these were not people mainly of Hindu background, Hindu families, if you like. There were not people who would say, I must be thinking about whether or not I'm going to be reincarnated. That was hardly, or just simply wasn't on the agenda. What was on the agenda was adapting and surviving. And these people adapted and survived because they had the grammar, the language of their tradition to refer to. Now, children are part of that way of life, what Wittgenstein would have called a form of life. They're part of that. They grow up within the family. So in that case, in that sense, I very much agree with John, but I also firmly believe in the concept of autonomy. And we may not all agree about this, but I think that education should be towards autonomy. And gradually young people, my daughters certainly did, make up their own minds about things and they become their own voice. And that's absolutely right. That's what growth and education is all about. And if people do retain a faith, it's never quite the same as that of their parents. It's similar with culture. Culture changes through the generations, and so does the expression of religion.
I take the point that you obviously want to bring up your children the way you think, as guardian readers and so on, as I do. But we don't have schools for guardian reading children, and we don't label children as guardian readers just because they're parents. That's all I'm saying. Obviously, I'm in favour of parents influencing their children in any way they like. But don't let the rest of society label a child by the persuasion of the parents, and religion is the only field in which we do that.
Yeah, Ruth Oswald, PhD student at the University of Birmingham and former primary school teacher who was for a short time in charge of RE in a primary school in Birmingham. I was interested in the idea that the panel seemed to reach some kind of consensus on, which was that we shouldn't be privileging the religious position. And I was wondering how we can kind of align ourselves with that when the admissions policies of faith schools in this country still enable faith schools to discriminate on the basis of faith if it is the case that they are oversubscribed. Of course, if they're undersubscribed, they have to admit all comers, but if they're oversubscribed, it's on the basis of faith, which is why you then get this thing that people say, think of the fees, get on your knees.
The admissions to schools point. In Anglican Church of England schools, let me just reassure you, we have 4,700. Of those, 67 have a policy that excludes, has the majority, by far the majority of Anglican children.
Children of Anglican
67.
parents.
Yeah, indeed. Well, but remember, what I'm saying, Richard, is that shorthand. I absolutely agree with you, but it is it's a useful shorthand. So it's 67 secondary schools, it's a handful of primaries in London, and it's 6 academies. That's out of 4,700 schools. So, and I'm very much in favour of schools being community-orientated.
David Conway from Civitas, the Institute for the Study of Civil Society. So far, none of the panellists have mentioned at all the other compulsory component in religious education besides what's come to be now just learning about the 6 main religions practiced in England and humanism if you're lucky or unlucky. But there is another component, a compulsory daily act of worship, which has fallen into even worse desuetude than the teaching of religious education. And I'd like to put it to the panel that it is actually logically impossible to engage in an act of worship without there being an object of that worship. And if one is merely to teach about religion so that the child is deprived of any nurturance into a faith community which gives them an object to worship, then the compulsory acts of worship will be meaningless, as they were in the case of my child at a community school when they had a harvest festival and being encouraged to give thanks not to the Common Agricultural Policy I'm grateful for, but to the farmers.
Now, I'm going to give myself the privilege of making one comment on the question about the act of worship. I looked into this matter when I was Secretary of State, including spending one Christmas reading the debate in the House of Lords in 1988, which made it not just an act of worship, but a, quote, predominantly Christian act of worship, one of the rare occasions on which the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher was defeated in the House of Lords, not, by the way, Richard, as a result of the bishops playing a particularly active role in that, but by a series of people who, in the Conservative Party, who wanted to see the change. I think there are real issues about the effect of it and whether it works. I hear what, John, you're saying about that, but I certainly think it's a good case for looking at it completely again. And I was just saying to Linda, I don't know how much research has been done on it, but I know many schools where the whole thing is completely a fake that is going forward in a completely unacceptable way. And I would think, actually, from the point of view of the faith themselves, not a good way of proceeding. And I think opening the question up would be a worthwhile thing to do. And I think there'd be better ways of achieving exactly, John, what you're saying by a different kind of device than the act of worship.